The silence of a hot summer afternoon is shattered. In a suburban parking lot, two cars pull up in tandem. Three men step out, each one moving with purpose, no hesitation in their gait. They glance round, checking their surroundings. Everything looks clear. They walk briskly to the building ahead. A union leader, the infamous Jimmy Hoffa, awaits his rendezvous. He's been promised a meeting with two powerful figures, men whose reputations precede them, Tony Giacalone and Anthony Provenzano. Top men in the Teamsters' corrupt leadership. But Hoffa, ever the survivor, senses something wrong. He'd been here before, after all. His instincts scream, but it's already too late. Inside the building, an agreement is made, though not in words. Hoffa's life, years of political maneuvers, and shady deals now hang by a thin thread. His last moments pass in an instant. No witnesses, just the cold and brutal execution of a man who believed his ties could protect him from the men he'd once worked with. The mob never showed it. The world was left with only a mystery. A disappearance so complete it was as if Hoffa had simply vanished into thin air. But what caused the end of Jimmy Hoffa was not just his criminal ties. It wasn't even a simple mob hit. The true reason runs deeper down into a web of power, betrayal, and the inevitable collision between political ambitions and mafia loyalties. Jimmy Hoffa was born on February 14, 1913, in the slums of Indiana, to working-class parents who struggled to make ends meet. The world Hoffa grew up in was one of hardship where survival was a daily battle. He learned early on that power didn't come from hard work alone. It came from unity. It came from organizing the labor force and demanding something more than the scraps that were handed to the working man. This idea, deeply ingrained in him, would be the foundation of Hoffa's future rise in the labor movement. By the time Hoffa reached his early 20s, he had already made a name for himself in the labor movement. His rise was meteoric, driven by a relentless drive to control the unions and to ensure the working class had a voice. Hoffa wasn't just a man of passion, he was a man of action. He was fiercely dedicated to organizing workers, even at the cost of bending the law. His ability to rally people around him made him an invaluable asset to the Teamsters. And it wasn't long before he became a fixture within the powerful union. But Hoffa's climb to the top wasn't without its price. His relationship with the Mafia began to take root as soon as he reached the upper echelons of union leadership. It wasn't a friendship of mutual respect, it was a business arrangement. The Teamsters needed the muscle, the influence, and the financial power the Mafia could provide. And the Mafia needed the access Hoffa's union could offer. Hoffa knew this. He understood the stakes. But he believed, like many men of his ambition, that he could control the game. The Mafia men he came to rely on, figures like Anthony Provenzano, Tony Giacalone, and others, were not merely criminals. They were businessmen, just like Hoffa. They had mastered the art of coercion, extortion, and power plays. Hoffa needed them for control, and they needed him for leverage. Over time, the symbiotic relationship deepened, and Hoffa became more entrenched in the underworld. The Teamsters were no longer just about unions, they were about corruption, backroom deals, and mafia-driven politics. Hoffa was no longer just a union leader, he was a key player in a much darker game. A game that was slowly but surely consuming him. The rise of Jimmy Hoffa is marked by a mix of ambition, ruthlessness, and an unwavering belief in his own invincibility. He wasn't naive to the risks. He understood the cost of power in the mafia world. But Hoffa had a dangerous belief that his own ambition was stronger than the men who surrounded him. His sharp political mind and unparalleled organizational skills were enough to make him a force to be reckoned with. Yet, it was his overconfidence that would ultimately lead to his downfall. As Hoffa's power grew, so did the resentment and distrust from within the ranks of both the Teamsters and the Mafia. Hoffa's tendency to burn bridges with both friends and foes alike meant that no one was truly safe, not even the men who had helped him rise. The deeper he went, the more entangled he became in a world of betrayal, lies, and violence, yet he believed he was untouchable, the master of his own destiny. But even as he played the political game, Hoffa was beginning to notice the subtle shift in power. Men who once revered him were now questioning his leadership. His ambition had left him isolated, surrounded by enemies both inside and outside the union. And the Mafia, with its long history of betrayals and shifting allegiances, began to look at Hoffa not as a trusted ally, but as a liability. Hoffa had outlived his usefulness in the eyes of the most powerful Mafia bosses. The same men who had once helped him climb to the top were now preparing to pull him down. Jimmy Hoffa wasn't just a union leader, he was a man who, like many before him, had underestimated the deadly nature of the power he sought to control. And like those before him, Hoffa would pay the ultimate price for it. By the late 1950s, Jimmy Hoffa had transformed from a regional labor leader into a national powerhouse. His rise was steeped in ambition, But it wasn't just his organizing skills that made him valuable, it was his uncanny ability to navigate the treacherous waters of organized crime. The Teamsters were not just a union, they were a force, and Hoffa knew how to make that force serve his ambitions. He understood that to make the union powerful, he had to secure the support of those who controlled the streets, the unions, and ultimately the power structure of America's cities. The Mafia, always with a sharp eye on profitable enterprises, saw the Teamsters as a key to power. The union controlled billions of dollars in pension funds, and Hoffa knew exactly how to leverage those funds for both personal and collective gain. The Mafia, with its penchant for skimming and money laundering, needed those funds to expand its influence. Hoffa offered them access. In return, the Mafia gave him muscle, protection, and a way to ensure that his political opponents would be silenced or co-opted. It was during this time that Hoffa first became deeply entangled with men like Tony Provenzano and Anthony Giacolone, Mafia figures who would play pivotal roles in Hoffa's life and death. Provenzano, a caporagime in the Genovese crime family, was one of Hoffa's key contacts. At first, Hoffa and Provenzano seemed to be allies, but beneath the surface, there was deep animosity. Hoffa's sharp political mind clashed with Provenzano's brutal methods. Hoffa, for all his intellect, was still a man trying to control a vast and violent empire. Provenzano, on the other hand, was a man who lived by the Mafia's code that Hoffa thought he could manipulate. As Hoffa's power grew, so did his enemies. He began to make enemies inside the union, where his autocratic style alienated many of his supporters. He forced through deals that others in the Teamsters found corrupt and self-serving. At the same time, he was relentlessly trying to regain control of the Teamsters after his prison sentence, and that meant pushing back against those in the Mafia who wanted to control the union's funds for their own purposes. But Hoffa's real strength was in his relationships with the most powerful Mafia bosses in America. He had the ear of men like the infamous mobster, Joe Kennedy, and even had ties to the Chicago outfit, led by the infamous Sam Giancana. These relationships were not born out of mutual respect. They were born out of necessity. Hoffa's leadership of the Teamsters was built on a series of alliances that kept the union's money flowing and its influence growing. But it was also a double-edged sword. Hoffa couldn't afford to be seen as too powerful. The Mafia had a long history of silencing men who threatened their control. Hoffa's rise had placed him in the most dangerous of positions at the top of the labor world, but also in the crosshairs of men who saw him as an unpredictable element. Hoffa's relationships with the Mafia became both a weapon and a liability. As he made moves to reclaim his position, he leaned on Mafia figures to do his bidding. But as his enemies grew in number, so did the risks. The union's finances were tightly controlled by the Mafia, and Hoffa knew that to maintain his power, he had to ensure their interests were protected. This meant cutting deals, hiding corruption, and keeping a dangerous alliance intact. But Hoffa also began to believe in his own invincibility. He thought that, because of his connections, he was untouchable. The turning point in Hoffa's rise came when he started to challenge the very people who had helped him get there. His attempt to regain control of the Teamsters in the late 1960s was seen as a direct threat to those in the Mafia who had invested in him. Hoffa's increasing ambition, his desire to be free of Mafia influence, and his inability to recognize when his usefulness was running out set him on a collision course with the very men who had once been his allies. As Hoffa's influence grew, so did the fear that he would destabilize the power structure the Mafia had spent decades building. Those who had once seen Hoffa as an ally began to question whether he was becoming a liability. The men who had once helped Hoffa achieve his greatest triumphs now began to plot his downfall. Hoffa had reached the peak of his power, but the higher you rise in the Mafia world, the further you have to fall. And Hoffa's fall would be a long, brutal one. By the summer of 1971, Jimmy Hoffa had become a figure who could not be ignored. But his comeback was not without controversy. The very political forces that had once embraced him began to turn their backs. Hoffa had spent years in prison, convicted of jury tampering, attempted bribery, and fraud. Upon his release, after receiving a commutation from President Richard Nixon, he had been forbidden from holding any office in the Teamsters until 1980. Yet, Hoffa, undeterred, started to maneuver his way back into power. The turning point came when Hoffa, defiant and still holding on to the belief that the Teamsters were his empire, sought to reclaim the presidency of the Union. His return to the Teamsters in 1971 marked a direct challenge to the existing leadership, which included a powerful contingent of Mafia figures. Hoffa's return wasn't welcomed by all, especially not by his former allies, who had moved on to more profitable ventures during his absence. The Mafia had grown accustomed to Hoffa's absence. His return was a threat to the status quo. Men like Provenzano, who had once worked closely with Hoffa, no longer trusted him. Their alliance had become strained over the years. Hoffa's attempt to reassert control was seen as not only a challenge to his old Mafia connections, but also as a political risk. The Mafia's relationship with the Teamsters was a carefully cultivated power structure, one that Hoffa, once at the top of, was now threatening to destabilize. One of the most telling events during this period was Hoffa's renewed involvement with the Mafia-controlled union pension funds. These funds were a crucial source of income for organized crime, and Hoffa's attempts to control them again put him at odds with Mafia figures, who now saw him as an obstacle. Hoffa's attempts to regain power were seen as a signal that he was willing to risk everything to reassert his dominance in the Union. Hoffa's re-entry into the political fray was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it gave him back the power he felt was rightfully his, but on the other hand, it painted a target on his back. Hoffa wasn't just challenging the Mafia, he was challenging the power structure that had become so deeply ingrained in the Teamsters. His bid for power represented the return of a man who had once been untouchable, but had now overstayed his welcome. For the Mafia, Hoffa's return was a betrayal of sorts. He had lost touch with the way things worked. His continued defiance of the Mafia's leaders, and his desire to regain the presidency of the Teamsters was seen as reckless. Two men like Provenzano and Giacalone, Hoffa had become a liability, and the Mafia's tolerance for him had worn thin. Hoffa, with his renewed vigor, failed to understand just how much power had shifted behind the scenes. He believed that his old allies, like the Mafia figures he had once worked with, would stand by him. But in reality, those men had moved on, and Hoffa was now a relic, a man whose time had passed. His defiance set in motion a series of events that would lead to his eventual downfall. He had become too ambitious, too erratic, and too unpredictable. And in the world of organized crime, unpredictability was dangerous. Those who could no longer be controlled or manipulated were expendable. His efforts to take control once again, to challenge the existing power structure, and to make a final push for dominance would lead directly to his disappearance. By 1975, Hoffa's political gambit had reached a critical juncture. His ambitious plans to regain control of the Teamsters, an organization he had once led with near total authority, were now veering dangerously toward an irreversible confrontation with the Mafia, the federal government, and his own union comrades. Hoffa's re-entry into the political game was seen not only as a challenge to the mob, but also as a threat to the established political order within organized labor. For Hoffa, the presidency of the Teamsters wasn't just a leadership position, it was a throne, and he was willing to do anything to reclaim it. The Mafia had long viewed the Teamsters as their financial backbone. With Hoffa back in play, they were no longer in control. He was meddling with Mafia interests, and that could not be allowed. Hoffa's return signaled a dangerous instability, especially given the increasing scrutiny from federal law enforcement agencies, such as the FBI, who had already been monitoring Hoffa and his ties to organized crime for years. The political and criminal environments in which Hoffa operated had changed. Since his release from prison, where once he had been a rising star, now he was a fading figure attempting to relive past glories. The mob, which had once held him as an ally, began to see him as a symbol of everything they were trying to distance themselves from, a liability, a public spectacle that threatened their quiet power. The escalating political situation was not just about Hoffa's bid for union control. It was also about power, secrecy, and survival. As Hoffa tried to regain favor with his old allies, his reassertion of control over the Teamsters came with a price. Hoffa had no real allies left. Provenzano had made it clear that Hoffa's leadership was no longer tolerated, and men like Giacalone, who had once played along with Hoffa's power, were now distancing themselves. They saw Hoffa as a threat to their influence, a man who believed he could play the game without following the rules. In the political sphere, Hoffa's attempts to challenge his rivals were no less destructive. His refusal to acknowledge the shifting tides made him a marked man. Hoffa wasn't just fighting for a position within the Union, he was fighting to maintain relevance in an environment where his influence was waning. The FBI, whose surveillance on Hoffa had increased significantly after his release, saw this power struggle as an opportunity. They hoped Hoffa's return would either lead to his fall or expose the corruption within the Teamsters. The increased attention from federal authorities only escalated the tensions within Hoffa's world. Hoffa's political efforts also alienated him from his own supporters. The Teamsters had changed during his time in prison. New men had risen in his absence, and they were less inclined to follow Hoffa's leadership style. He represented an old era, one in which brute force and political machinations were enough to secure a union's dominance. But in 1975, Hoffa was no longer seen as the unifying figure he once had been. His inability to adapt to the changing political environment within his own union sowed the seeds of his downfall. Simultaneously, Hoffa's desperation to reassert control clashed with the political ambitions of others in the Union. Men like Frank Fitzsimmons, who had taken Hoffa's place during his incarceration, had established their own influence. Fitzsimmons, with the Mafia's backing, had consolidated power and had no desire to see Hoffa return. The political escalation between Hoffa and his adversaries within the Teamsters, fueled by Hoffa's ambition and his inability to understand the shifting landscape, meant that the Union was at war not just with the Mafia, but with itself. The stage was set for a deadly confrontation. The increasingly volatile situation only heightened Hoffa's isolation. He believed that by making deals with the Mafia and his old allies, he could regain what he had lost. But the Mafia no longer had use for him. The Mafia's dealings had become more sophisticated, less reliant on Union muscle, and Hoffa was simply an outdated commodity. He refused to accept that, and in his refusal, he had set the stage for the events that would lead to his disappearance. As Hoffa's political and Mafia enemies closed in, his own failure to adapt to the shifting tides of power meant that he was trapped in a dangerous web of alliances, betrayals, and his own increasingly erratic actions. He believed his comeback was inevitable, but the more he pushed, the further he fell into a deadly trap of his own making. As the summer of 1975 wore on, Jimmy Hoffa's fate was sealed. His attempts to regain control over the Teamsters and restore his former influence had not only isolated him from the Mafia, but had also alienated him from his closest allies. Within the Union, Hoffa's old allies, the men he had trusted the most, began to turn against him. Men like Frank Fitzsimmons, who had taken over the presidency of the Teamsters during Hoffa's imprisonment, had become entrenched in their power. They had become the new faces of the Teamsters, the ones who had managed to keep the Mafia happy while maintaining a semblance of legitimacy. Hoffa, on the other hand, had become an outdated figure, a relic of a bygone era. What Hoffa failed to understand, perhaps the most dangerous mistake of his career, was that the world had changed while he was behind bars. The Mafia, which had once relied on Hoffa's Union for control and profit, no longer saw him as an asset. Hoffa's attempt to control the Union's financial muscle and return the Teamsters to Mafia-dominated operations only intensified the rift. The relationship Hoffa had once enjoyed with Mafia figures like Tony Giacalone and Anthony Provenzano had grown strained. These men, powerful in their own right, had moved on. Hoffa, stubborn and desperate, was unwilling to accept the truth. His time was over. His isolation wasn't just from the Mafia, it was from the very men who had once fought beside him. In the trenches of Union politics, the increasingly polarized environment within the Teamsters meant that Hoffa was seen as a liability by many. Fitzsimmons, with the backing of the Mafia, was growing stronger. He had the Union's resources under his control and had secured the support of many who had once been Hoffa's loyal soldiers. Fitzsimmons was a cautious man, one who understood the need to keep a low profile. But he also knew that Hoffa's ambitions were becoming dangerous. Hoffa wasn't just trying to retake the presidency, he was undermining the new political order that had been carefully established. Fitzsimmons knew that Hoffa's return to power was a threat to everything he had built. But it wasn't just Hoffa's political opponents within the Teamsters who were turning against him, it was the Mafia as well. Hoffa had once been a trusted ally, but his rise had been followed by a series of missteps that undermined his influence. The Mafia, led by men like Provenzano, Giacalone, and others, were in the process of moving away from Hoffa's brand of old-school Union politics. The Union's financial assets were being used in ways Hoffa didn't approve of, and he wasn't the man he once was. The Mafia's power was now tied to different interests, and Hoffa was seen as a symbol of instability. The growing tension between Hoffa and the Mafia had reached a boiling point. Hoffa's actions had made him a dangerous man to be associated with, a man who was too unpredictable for even the most ruthless criminals. The same men who had helped him rise now began to see Hoffa as an obstacle to their goals. For them, Hoffa was a relic of a time when Union leaders were useful, but now he was simply an impediment to a more profitable future. Hoffa's isolation had reached its peak. He was cut off from both the Mafia and his own people, surrounded by enemies who knew he was a liability. He had become expendable. The tipping point came when Hoffa sought a meeting with two Mafia figures who had long been his allies, Tony Giacalone and Anthony Provenzano. Hoffa believed that by meeting with them, he could broker a deal to regain his power. What Hoffa didn't know was that this was no longer a negotiation, it was a setup. The meeting was a trap. Hoffa had been lured into a false sense of security. His own desperation and the weight of his isolation blinded him to the danger that was closing in on him. The men he thought would be his allies were now preparing to eliminate him. Hoffa's fall had begun. long before his disappearance. It had started with his refusal to adapt, with his belief that he could always outmaneuver his enemies. But in the world of organized crime, there is no place for men who refuse to understand when their time has passed. Hoffa's desperate pursuit of power had become his downfall, and in the final moments, he was left with no one to turn to, not the Mafia, not the Teamsters, and not even the men who had once been his closest allies. On the evening of July 30th, 1975, Hoffa arrived at the Matches Red Fox restaurant in suburban Detroit. He was meeting with Giacalone and Provenzano. What Hoffa didn't know was that this meeting would be his last. His isolation, the betrayal by his closest allies, and his failure to recognize the danger had all led him to this moment. As he walked into that parking lot, Hoffa was already a dead man, though he had no idea. The trap had been set, and Hoffa had fallen right into it. The evening of July 30th, 1975, dawned like any other, but for Jimmy Hoffa, it was to be his last. The setting, the Matches Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Township, a quiet suburb of Detroit. Hoffa had received a call earlier that day from his old allies, Tony Giacalone and Anthony Provenzano. Both men, powerful figures in the Mafia, had agreed to meet with him. It was a simple request: meet, talk, settle differences. Or so Hoffa thought. What he didn't know, however, was that the meeting was a carefully constructed trap, one designed to take him out once and for all. Hoffa arrived at the restaurant around 1 p.m., dressed in a suit, but there was no sign of the men he had come to meet. As Hoffa waited, alone, he was growing increasingly uneasy. The phone calls had been vague, and there were no signs of Giacalone or Provenzano. His gut told him something was wrong. It wasn't the first time Hoffa had been left waiting, but there was something about this particular moment that felt off. The clock ticked on, and the longer Hoffa waited, the more exposed he felt. When he made the decision to leave, it was already too late. Hoffa was walking toward the exit of the restaurant when a car pulled up outside. 2 men stepped out. Hoffa recognized them, but not as his friends. These men had been assigned to kill him, to carry out the Mafia's final judgment. They had been tasked with silencing him permanently. What Hoffa didn't know was that these men were not the real threat. The true enemy lay in the shadows of supposed allies, Giacalone and Provenzano. The 2 men approached Hoffa and led him to the back of the parking lot. The plan was simple: Hoffa would be ambushed, executed, and then erased from the Mafia's world. No trace, no witnesses, no question. Hoffa, surrounded by enemies, was forced into the car and driven away. As Hoffa was driven, the air was thick with tension, his fate sealed in those last moments of his life. The men who had been his allies in the past, the same men who had helped him rise to the top, were now the ones ensuring his downfall. Provenzano, Giacalone, and their associates had orchestrated it all. Hoffa, blinded by desperation and the belief that his return to power was imminent, had ignored all the warning signs. He had been played. The brutal irony was that Hoffa's own ambition had led him into a trap, set by the very people he trusted. His body was never found. There were no witnesses to the final moments of Jimmy Hoffa's life. What followed in the aftermath of his execution was a frenzy of speculation, theories, and a government investigation that would go nowhere. Hoffa had been eliminated with ruthless efficiency, in a way that left no trace. The men who carried out the job were professionals, and the Mafia had made sure Hoffa's disappearance would remain just that, a disappearance. It was as if Hoffa had vanished into thin air, leaving nothing behind but questions. The world may never know the full truth of what happened to Jimmy Hoffa in those final moments, but the reality is that Hoffa's fate was sealed long before he walked into the Matches Red Fox. His failure to recognize the shifting power dynamics within the Mafia and the Union, his refusal to see that his time had passed, and his belief that he could control the very men who had once helped him rise, led to his execution. The mob never showed the brutal murder of Jimmy Hoffa. Instead, they wiped him from history, leaving behind a shadow, a name that would forever haunt the American landscape. And the most chilling aspect of it all was the realization that Hoffa's execution wasn't just about a Union leader, it was about a man who had lost control of the very forces he had once harnessed. Hoffa's death wasn't just the end of a man, it was the end of an era. Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance did not just send shockwaves through the labor world. It sent tremors through American society, a nation already rife with corruption, betrayal, and the ever-present shadow of organized crime. Hoffa was not just a Union leader. He was an icon. His death, or rather his vanishing, left a gaping hole in the American labor movement, one that could never be filled. The Mafia, which had once used Hoffa to bolster their criminal empire, was now left to deal with the fallout. Hoffa's death was no longer just a Union issue, it was a political and public scandal. The immediate aftermath was a media frenzy. The FBI, under the leadership of J. Edgar Hoover, had long been suspicious of Hoffa and his ties to organized crime. Hoffa's disappearance was seen as the culmination of years of investigations, and the pressure to solve the case mounted quickly. But no one was talking. The Mafia, as it always had, closed ranks, and the few who knew the truth were not about to reveal it. In the absence of answers, rumors ran wild. Hoffa had been buried under a driveway. He had been fed to the fish in the Detroit River. There were endless theories, each one more outlandish than the last. But the reality was far simpler and far more brutal. Hoffa had been eliminated, erased from the face of the earth, and the people who knew the truth were never going to speak. The FBI investigation into Hoffa's disappearance was, at best, an exercise in futility. Despite relentless interrogations, surveillance, and countless false leads, no solid evidence was ever found to pinpoint Hoffa's killers. The mob, tight-lipped and insular, offered nothing. Hoffa's enemies, his supposed allies in the Mafia, were careful not to leave any trace behind. Hoffa's murder was the epitome of organized crime's ability to operate without a trace. Its power so great that even the law seemed powerless in the face of it. Within the Teamsters, Hoffa's absence was felt in different ways. His loyal supporters, those who had worked under his rule, found themselves caught between allegiance to a man they had revered and the new leadership that had already taken hold. Frank Fitzsimmons, Hoffa's old vice president, took the reins of the union with the Mafia's backing, but he was always seen as Hoffa's shadow. The Teamsters moved forward, but the lingering question of Hoffa's disappearance haunted the organization, just as it haunted the nation. Hoffa had been both the figurehead and the face of a movement. His removal left a void that no one seemed able to fill. The most unsettling consequence of Hoffa's death was the ripple effect it had on the Mafia itself. Hoffa's violent end wasn't just the assassination of a man. It was the destruction of a fragile alliance that had existed between the Mafia and the Union. Hoffa had been a pivotal figure in connecting organized crime to the legitimate world of unions. His death marked the end of an era in which the Mafia's ties to labor unions were an open secret. As Hoffa's influence evaporated, the Mafia found itself scrambling to maintain control of the Teamsters, without the direct leadership Hoffa had provided. This shift led to a more covert, more insulated form of Mafia power, one that was less dependent on union leadership and more focused on money laundering, extortion, and other illegal enterprises. But Hoffa's murder also sent a message to the underworld. It was a reminder that in the Mafia, loyalty could be fleeting, and even the most powerful men could be eliminated if they outlived their usefulness. Hoffa had failed to adapt to the changing power dynamics, and in doing so, he became expendable. His murder was not an isolated incident, it was part of a much larger pattern of violence and betrayal that defined the world of organized crime. It was a world where alliances shifted like sand, where power was never guaranteed, and where the ultimate price for failure was death. The investigation into Hoffa's disappearance may have been a failure, but the lessons of his death were clear. The Mafia's ability to eliminate its enemies, even the ones it had once helped build, was a chilling reminder of the cold, brutal reality of organized crime. Hoffa's death revealed not just the viciousness of the Mafia, but also the frailty of the systems that sought to control it. Political systems, law enforcement agencies, and unions could all be manipulated, but in the end, it was the Mafia that always held the upper hand. It was an inescapable truth that no one, not even Jimmy Hoffa, could change. The story of Jimmy Hoffa is not just the tale of a man's rise and fall. It is a reflection of the dangerous allure of power, the cost of ambition, and the fragility of human relationships in the world of organized crime. Hoffa's life reveals the deep, unsettling truth that the price for playing in the shadows of corruption and violence is often one's very existence. In the case of Hoffa, the truth is not just about his disappearance, it's about what his life and death tell us about the nature of power, loyalty, and betrayal. At its core, Hoffa's downfall is a story of blind ambition. He believed that his connections, his political savvy, and his power within the labor movement made him untouchable. Hoffa saw himself as a man who could play both sides, the legitimate union world and the Mafia world, without facing the consequences. But as his enemies multiplied and the Mafia's influence grew, Hoffa found himself trapped in a web of his own making. He failed to see that the forces he had once controlled had now become the very forces that would destroy him. What Hoffa's story teaches us is that power, when abused or misunderstood, can be its own undoing. The Mafia, as it always had, played the long game. It moved in silence, using manipulation, fear, and violence to maintain control. Hoffa, on the other hand, lived in the open. His ambition was transparent. His desire to reclaim the Teamsters was obvious. In the end, It wasn't just the Mafia that turned on Hoffa, it was his failure to adapt to a changing world that led to his death. His blindness to the shifting power dynamics within the Union and the underworld made him a target. Hoffa thought he could control the game, but in reality, he was merely a pawn in a much larger, more dangerous game that he didn't fully understand. Hoffa's death serves as a haunting reminder of the dangers of isolation. As Hoffa's allies turned against him, he found himself alone, surrounded by enemies on all sides. His belief in his invincibility had led him to underestimate the men who once helped him rise. The Mafia, the Union, the law, each was a piece of the puzzle Hoffa thought he could control, but none were in his corner when it mattered. In the final moments, when Hoffa was lured to his death, there was no one left to save him. His ambition had not only made him powerful, it had made him vulnerable. The very alliances he had built his career on had become the chains that would bind him in his final moments. And then there's the tragic irony. Hoffa's death, so shrouded in secrecy and violence, never gave him the closure or finality he deserved. His disappearance has remained one of America's greatest unsolved mysteries. But perhaps the true mystery lies in the system that allowed men like Hoffa to rise, only to be destroyed by the very forces they believed they could control. Hoffa's disappearance was not just a crime, it was a reflection of the system that produced him. A system of power, corruption, and betrayal, where loyalty is fleeting and survival is the ultimate prize. In the world of organized crime, there are no lasting legacies. There is only the relentless pursuit of power, and in Hoffa's case, his belief that he could defy the rules of that world led to his tragic end. His death, ultimately, was not just a political move, it was a warning to anyone who sought to challenge the established order. Hoffa's story is a cautionary tale about the limits of ambition, the dangers of betrayal, and the brutal price of loyalty in a world where survival depends on the most ruthless and cunning. As we reflect on Hoffa's life and his brutal execution, we are left with one central question. What does it take to survive in a world ruled by power, corruption, and betrayal? Hoffa, for all his ambition, could never answer that question. In the end, it was the same question that led to his death. And for all the men who came after him, the answer remains as elusive as Hoffa himself.